there's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It fills the room like pressure, like everyone in it is holding their breath at the exact same moment, and nobody knows who's going to exhale first. I've thought about that silence a lot over the past year. About what it meant. About what it cost me to finally be standing in a room where people could see me, really see me, and have the one person whose opinion I'd spent 30 years trying to stop caring about sitting just 15 feet away, finally unable to look anywhere else. That moment didn't arrive without a long road behind it, and if I'm going to tell it right, I have to start at the beginning, at the dining room table in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, when I was 19 years old and I told my father I'd been accepted to the FBI's honors internship program. He was cutting a piece of steak. He didn't stop. "That's nice," he said. "Your cousin Lily got into Tulane's nursing program." My mother looked up from her plate, then back down again. My younger brother didn't register it at all. He was 14, and already somewhere else in his head. And that was it. That was the whole conversation. I sat there for a moment waiting for something else. Some follow-up question. Some version of tell me more, or how'd you pull that off, or even just what does that mean for you? Nothing came. My father lifted his glass of sweet tea. My mother asked my brother about baseball practice. I pushed my green beans around my plate and felt something I couldn't name back then. Something I'd spend the next 2 decades slowly learning to recognize as grief. Not grief for something lost. Grief for something that had never existed in the first place. My name is Nora. I'm 34 years old now, and I work as a special agent for the FBI's Cyber Division, out of our field office in Washington, D.C. I've been with the Bureau for 11 years. I have a clearance I can't fully discuss, a caseload that keeps me up at night for reasons I'm not allowed to share at dinner parties, and, as of 18 months ago, a commendation from the director himself that came with a formal ceremony in a building most people only ever see in news footage. None of that would have impressed my father. To be fair, I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it with a kind of tired clarity that only comes from spending long enough watching someone be exactly who they are. And finally, accepting that you're not going to change it with accomplishment. You're not going to change it at all. My father, Hank, Harold, technically, but nobody called him that, grew up in a small town outside Shreveport and believed with his whole chest that the right way to live was trade school or college for something practical, a job with your hands or a steady paycheck from a company that made things, a house, a spouse, children before 35. He wasn't cruel about it. He didn't yell. He just had a way of making you feel like anything outside his framework wasn't quite real. Like you told him you wanted to be a character in a novel. My older sister, Tessa, was his framework. She went to LSU for early childhood education, married a civil engineer named Ray when she was 26, had a daughter named Avery 2 years later, and lived 11 minutes from my parents' house in the same suburb where we'd grown up. My father adored her. He talked about her the way some people talk about good weather. Constantly, fondly, as though its presence was proof that the world was working the way it was supposed to. I was the other thing. I was the one who'd gotten into an honors program at Georgetown and moved away at 18. Who'd double majored in criminology and computer science, done the internship and then the application process, and then the academy and then 11 years of work that I could only describe in vague terms at Christmas. I was the one who'd never married, who rented an apartment in a city my father thought was full of people, who hated people like him, who called on Sundays but couldn't always explain what I'd been doing all week. "Your sister's doing good," he'd say when I called. And then the conversation would list slowly toward what Avery had done in preschool. How Ray's firm had landed a new contract. Whether my mother's sister was doing better after her hip replacement. And I'd listen. And I'd say the right things. And somewhere around the 20-minute mark I'd feel that familiar ache. That sense of being on the outside of a glass. Looking in at something warm. That wasn't quite for me. It didn't make me love him less. That's the part that's hard to explain. I loved my father. I loved that he coached my brother's little league for 6 years and never missed a game. I loved that he still called my mother sweetheart after 39 years. I loved that he cried at movies and then pretended he wasn't. And that he made the best red beans and rice I've ever tasted. And that when I was 11 and had my heart broken by a best friend, who stopped talking to me without explanation, he sat outside my bedroom door and told me through the wood that it wasn't my fault, that some people just didn't know a good thing when they had it. He loved me. I never doubted that. He just didn't know what to do with me. Last April, my sister Tessa got remarried. Her first marriage had ended 6 years earlier. Ray had turned out to be someone other than who she thought. And she'd handled it with the quiet dignity she brought to everything, rebuilt her life, raised Avery mostly on her own, and eventually met a man named Graham at a work conference in Nashville. Graham was a structural engineer, 42, divorced once himself. With a 10-year-old son named Cooper he had every other week. He was steady and warm and he laughed easily. And from the moment I met him I could see that he looked at my sister, like she was the most interesting person in any room. The wedding was in Baton Rouge. Of course it was. At a venue outside the city, an old restored plantation house turned event space, the kind of place with Spanish moss draped over the oak trees and string lights along the garden path. Tessa had good taste. The whole thing was beautiful. I flew in from DC 2 days early. My mother cried when she saw me at the door. My father shook my hand. He'd always shaken my hand after I turned 22, as if my leaving for good had changed the grammar of our relationship, and said I looked thin and asked if I'd eaten on the plane. I said I had. He nodded. We sat in the living room watching a college football game we didn't care about until my mother called us for dinner. That night, after my mother had gone to bed and my brother, who lived in Austin now, had headed back to his hotel, I sat with my father on the back porch for a while. It was the kind of Louisiana evening, and something older than either of us, and for a few minutes we didn't talk, just listened to the frogs. Tessa's happy, he said. She is, I said. Graham's a good man. He is. He swirled his glass. You seeing anyone? No, I said. Not right now. He nodded slowly, and I waited for what always came next, the gentle redirect, the comment that wasn't quite a comment, the way he had of making a simple answer sound like a small failure. But he just looked out at the yard and said, "That's all right." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said nothing. Later, lying in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling, I thought about what I'd wanted him to ask. Not about whether I was seeing someone. I'd wanted him to ask about the case I'd closed 3 months earlier. The one that had made the news, without my name attached to it, one that had taken 22 months and a team of 8, and resulted in the arrest of a network that had been running ransomware attacks against hospital systems across 9 states. I'd wanted him to ask about the ceremony, about the commendation, about what it felt like to stand in a room and have the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation look me in the eye and say my name. He didn't know about any of it. I hadn't told him. I'd tried once since 2 years before, over the phone. I'd mentioned carefully that I was working on something significant. He'd said, "Is it dangerous?" And when I'd said it was more technical than dangerous, he'd made a small sound and said, "Well, as long as you're staying safe," and then asked if I'd heard that Tessa had put in a raised garden bed in the backyard. After that, I stopped trying to tell him things. The morning of the wedding, something happened that I've replayed enough times, that the edges of it have gone a little soft. I was in the hotel room Tessa had booked for me, getting dressed. I'd worn my nicest dress, a deep navy wrap dress that I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I'd done my hair and I was running maybe 12 minutes ahead of schedule, which for me was basically a personal record for non-work events. My phone buzzed. A text from my father. It said, "Tessa looks beautiful. You should have gotten here earlier to help her get ready. She needed her sister." I read it twice. I'd offered to help. I'd texted Tessa the night before and asked, and she'd said she had her maid of honor and 2 of her college friends, and that I should just rest and she'd see me at the venue. I'd done exactly what she'd asked. But that wasn't the part that landed wrong. The part that landed wrong was the second sentence. She needed her sister. Not "we missed you" or "she wished you'd been there." The implication was clear. I'd been absent. I was always absent. Even when I wasn't. I put the phone face down on the dresser and stood there for a moment, looking at myself in the mirror. I looked fine. I looked like a version of myself that was doing okay. I picked up the phone and typed back. I offered. She said she had it covered. "I'll see you there." He didn't respond. The ceremony was genuinely lovely. Tessa was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the dress. She had that particular glow of someone who has been through something hard and come out the other side and found their way to something good. I sat in the second row and cried a little during the vows and felt proud of her in a way that had no complication in it at all. The reception was at the same venue, moving inside as the evening cooled. Round tables with candles, a band playing jazz standards, a bar that was well stocked and efficiently run. I sat at a table with my parents, my brother and his girlfriend Pam, and Graham's sister and her husband, who were from outside Memphis, and very friendly in a way that didn't require much from me. I was doing fine. I was in a good groove, talking to people, staying present, keeping my wine at a pace that was social rather than coping. And then, at some point during the cocktail hour, a woman I didn't recognize came up to me and introduced herself as Deborah. She was a colleague of Graham's. She'd heard I worked for the FBI, and she was curious about cybercrime. We ended up talking for maybe 20 minutes. It was a genuinely good conversation. She was sharp, asked real questions, and the kind of interested that makes you want to give real answers. I was explaining something about how financial fraud networks use layers of shell accounts when I felt my father appear at my elbow. "Nora," he said. "Hey, Dad. The family photos are happening," he said. "Oh, now, your mother's been looking for you." I excused myself from Deborah, who pressed her card into my hand and said she'd love to continue the conversation sometime. I followed my father toward the area where the photographer had gathered the family, and somewhere in that walk, maybe 10 steps, he said, quietly. Not loud enough for anyone else to hear. You don't have to perform for everyone you meet, you know. It's your sister's night. I stopped walking. He kept moving for 2 steps before he realized I'd stopped, and then he turned and looked at me, and his expression was the one he always had when he thought I was being sensitive about something. Not unkind, just slightly impatient. I was having a conversation, I said. I know, he said. I just mean. It's not a networking event. I wasn't networking. She asked about my work, right? He said it in a way that suggested he was deciding not to argue, which was somehow worse than arguing. I took a breath. I followed him to the photographer. I smiled in the photos. I stood next to my mother, who squeezed my hand and said I looked beautiful, and I held on to that for the rest of the cocktail hour, like it was a rope. We were maybe 90 minutes into the reception when the doors on the far side of the ballroom opened. I didn't notice at first. I was at the dessert table, deliberating between the bread pudding and the praline cheesecake, in the way you only can when you're from Louisiana and both options are genuinely competitive. It was my aunt who touched my arm. Nora, she said. Honey, do you know those people? I looked up, coming through the doors, in neat professional dress, not suits exactly, but that unmistakable posture, that particular way of moving through a room like they'd been trained to take up exactly the space they needed, and no more, were people I recognized, my team, or most of it, and not just my team. I recognized Kendall first. She'd been my partner on the hospital ransomware case, the one who'd worked 60-hour weeks for 4 months straight and had still found time to bring donuts to the office on Fridays. She was grinning at me from across the room. Next to her was Marcus's replacement, a younger agent named Theo, who I'd mentored for the past year. I caught myself thinking he's not on the list, then remembered with a start that I was thinking about a different list entirely. And behind them were more faces, people from the DC office, people from the field teams we'd collaborated with, people who had worked pieces of cases I'd led over the past decade. I counted. Later. There were 43 of them. And behind all of them, walking in with the unhurried ease of someone who owned every room she entered, was Assistant Director Pamela Chen. The band had been in the middle of a Louis Armstrong song. They stopped. Not because anyone told them to. I found out later that Kendall had coordinated it through the venue coordinator, that this had been planned for weeks, that Graham had been in on it, because Tessa had told him about the commendation, and he'd reached out to Kendall through a mutual contact and asked if there was any way to make it happen. Tessa had planned this. My sister had done this. Director Chen stopped in the center of the room. She had a voice that did not need a microphone, and she used it. 11 years ago, she said, a 23-year-old agent joined our field office in Washington as a new recruit. She was quiet and she was sharp and she had an absolute refusal to let anything stay unsolved. In the 11 years since, she has led or contributed to 47 significant cases, closed 3 long-term investigations that had been open for over a decade, and last November, she led the team that dismantled one of the most sophisticated ransomware networks ever operated on American soil. That network had attacked 31 hospitals. It had compromised patient records for over 2 million people. It had cost lives, because when hospital systems go down, people in ICUs don't always make it through the window, and she shut it down. The room was quiet. Completely quiet. The commendation ceremony, Chen continued, happened in February. She didn't tell most of you. I'm told she didn't even tell her family. She paused and her eyes, which were, I should tell you, deeply calm and deeply amused at the same time, found mine across the room, so we thought we'd come tell them ourselves. Kendall stepped forward first, then the others, in a wave, all of them, one after another, standing to attention the way you only ever see in situations that are not ordinary situations. I didn't cry at the ceremony in February. I'm not someone who cries easily in professional settings. There's something about the bureau culture that wires that out of you. Or maybe it was wired out of me before I ever walked through the door. I cried now. Not sobbing, nothing dramatic, just the quiet kind of tears that happen when something long held finally has somewhere to go. I turned instinctively to look at my father. He was standing at the table. He had a look on his face I had never seen before. Not in 34 years. It wasn't pride exactly. It was bigger than that. It was the look of someone realizing something, in real time, and not being fully equipped to process it. His mouth was slightly open. He was looking at me. Not past me, not at the room or the spectacle or the people in their professional dress. He was looking at me. Director Chen raised her glass. The room raised their glasses. My aunt made a sound I would describe as a sustained, overwhelmed exhale. And then started applauding, and then everyone was applauding, and somewhere in the middle of it all Tessa appeared at my side and wrapped her arms around me from behind and said quietly in my ear, I've been waiting to do this for years. Don't be mad. I laughed, I couldn't help it. I'm not mad, I said. Good, she said. Because I also told Graham to seat you next to Director Chen at dinner, and I need you to be okay with that. Tessa, I know. It's your wedding. It's my wedding and I can do what I want, she said. squeezing me once more before she pulled away. And what I want is for my sister to know that I see her. Okay? That's it. That's all this is. The rest of the night blurred a little, in the good way that good nights do. I talked to director Chen at dinner, and it turned out she was a jazz fan, and had opinions about whether the band's rendition of Misty was accurate to the original recording, and we debated it good-naturedly for 20 minutes. I danced with my brother, who stepped on my feet twice and apologized both times with the sincerity of someone who had known he was going to step on my feet. Kendall and I found a corner of the bar and did what we always do, which is debrief unnecessarily about things that didn't need debriefing, and it was the best version of that we'd ever done. My father found me around 9:30. The venue had gotten warm, and I'd stepped outside onto the garden terrace for some air. The string lights were still on, and the oak trees were doing their moss thing in the dark, and I was standing there with a glass of water, thinking about nothing in particular, when I heard his footstep on the flagstone behind me. He stood next to me. We looked at the trees. I didn't know, he said. I know, I said. Any of it. He paused. The hospitals, it's not something I lead with, I said. He was quiet for a while. A long while for him. Why didn't you tell me, he said. And it wasn't defensive, the thing I'd spent years bracing for. It was just quiet, and it almost broke me more than the defensive version would have. I tried, I said, a couple of times. It didn't seem like you. I stopped. Started over. It didn't seem like it was something you were interested in. I was interested, he said. And then, lower. I just didn't know how to. I don't understand most of it. The technical stuff. I never knew what to ask. That landed differently than I expected. I'd spent years reading his silence as indifference. I hadn't fully considered that it might have also been something like inadequacy, that maybe he hadn't asked because he was afraid of asking the wrong thing, and so he'd asked nothing instead. Neither of us said anything for a moment. That woman, he said, the director. She said you led it. I did, I said. All those people, he said. They came here for you. They came for Tessa's wedding, I said. Nora, they did, I said smiling, but also for me. Yeah. He made a sound that I couldn't quite interpret. And then, and I want to be careful to describe this accurately, because it's one of those things where the details matter. He put his arm around my shoulders. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with his arm around me, looking at the trees. My father was not a hugger. He was a handshaker, a shoulder clapper, a man who expressed affection through acts of service and presence and the absence of complaint. In 34 years, I could count the times he'd hugged me on fewer fingers than I have. This wasn't a hug, but it was something. We stood there for a while, until the band started playing something slow from inside, and I could hear Tessa laughing through the doors. I'm proud of you, he said. It was quiet enough that I almost missed it. He said it to the trees. Thank you, I said. We didn't say anything else for a while after that. Eventually he said his knee was starting to give him trouble, and he was going to sit down, and I said I'd come in a minute. And he nodded and walked back inside, and I stood there alone in the garden under the lights for another few minutes, breathing Louisiana air, and letting everything settle. 3 weeks later, I got a package in the mail at my apartment in D.C. The return address was my parents' house in Baton Rouge. Inside was a shoebox. Not a gift box, a literal shoebox, the kind my father kept in his closet, and inside the shoebox was a stack of papers, newspaper clippings, printouts, a few handwritten notes on index cards. I sat down on my kitchen floor to go through them. I don't know why the floor. It just felt right. He'd kept things. Clippings from the Baton Rouge Advocate when a case I'd been tangentially involved in had made the local news. Printouts from the DOJ website where my name appeared as part of a task force. A brief mention in a magazine article about cybersecurity that I'd forgotten I'd ever been quoted in. He'd circled my name in ballpoint pen and written in the margin, "This is my daughter." There were index cards with dates and notes. Things like Nora's team made the news. Didn't call, so she must be busy. Going to ask her about it Sunday. And then a follow-up card. Forgot to ask. She seemed tired. Not indifference. Attention, without the tools to do anything with it. At the bottom of the box was a note in his handwriting, on a piece of his old, personalized stationery, from when he'd had a small business in the 90s. He wrote, "Rona, I've been keeping these for a while. I don't have a good reason I never showed you. I should have. I want you to know I've always known you were doing something that mattered. I wasn't always good at saying so. I am not good at saying so. I'm trying to be better. Love, Dad." I read it 3 times. I sat on my kitchen floor for probably 10 more minutes after that, not doing anything in particular, just being a person in a room with a box of proof that love doesn't always speak the language you're waiting to hear. Then I got up and put the note on my refrigerator, where it still is. I called him on Sunday the way I always did. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always did. "Got your package," I said. "I know," he said. "Been sitting in the closet for 2 years. Figured it was time." "The magazine one," I said. "You circled my name." A pause. "I did. You wrote, 'This is my daughter.'" Another pause. And then so quietly I almost couldn't catch it. Well, you are. Outside my window, the city was doing its usual thing. Traffic and sirens and the low, constant hum of a place that doesn't really sleep. But for a minute, on the phone with my father, it felt very still. I'll come home at Thanksgiving, I said. We'd like that, he said. And then, your mother's going to make the bread pudding. Tell her I want the extra whiskey sauce. He laughed. It was a real one, the kind that went all the way up into his voice. I'll tell her. We talked for another 40 minutes about nothing much. Football and the weather and what my brother was doing in Austin, and whether Avery had lost her 2 front teeth yet. Regular things. Ordinary things. When we hung up, I sat there for a second before I put the phone down. Not angry, not sad, not even particularly triumphant. Just present, just here. 34 years old, sitting in my apartment in Washington, D.C. with a note on my refrigerator and a father who'd kept a shoebox in his closet for 2 years, trying to find the words. That's enough. It turned out that was enough.